welcome to Dome Theory number 86. We're here with, back on the show, probably the quickest turnaround back on the show we've had, Matt Brooks, because what have we done? 4 net shows over the last month and a half here on this show. We had Justin from Brooklyn's beat on a couple weeks ago, and that was right before the Kevin Durant trade request. I remember saying to him, I was like, as we were trying to figure out what was going to happen in the aftermath of the Kyrie Irving player option exception, would Kevin Durant last much longer? And I was thinking maybe a month or two into the season, if things aren't going well, maybe you'll get a trade request from him. But it happened, I think, the next day or two after I recorded that podcast. So here we are 4 weeks later after that request. Not much has happened. And even this report that we kicked around on the Garden Report yesterday, by all accounts now, a couple of reports coming out, is at least, Zach Lowe said, 10 days old at this point, if we're talking about the 16th. So that's fairly recently that these two teams have talked. Woj saying that these teams have been in regular contact here. And my listeners don't like it. Celtics fans in general don't like this, Matt. I just put out a poll yesterday. I think 60% outright said no way to any Brown for Durant flip. And about 20% on top of that said it depends how much more you add on top of it. So our starting point here, Brown, White, a pick. We'll see if we can come to a deal here. But what was your reaction early Monday morning when we found out that the Celtics were getting involved here?
Heard it kicked around a little bit in, was it like early July? Kind of like right when the request, I guess, was made. I didn't know if it, I didn't hear about anything about a formal offer, but I knew just I heard stuff about a Jaylen Brown, base package essentially. So hearing that it was actually made was pretty interesting. And how serious those conversations were, we don't really know. We certainly have a good feeling that those conversations are not happening actively. But this was something that I heard, and I wasn't shocked to see it come out. I just was surprised, I guess, to see that there was a real deal offer made.
Yeah, so the Celtics, from my perspective, they must have had real interest here, or still do maybe, in adding Durant, and there's no surprise there. A guy like this can push you over that finish line for a championship, and he did that in Golden State. It looked like he was on the verge of doing it in 2021 in Brooklyn. I usually don't give them much credit, but if a couple injuries didn't happen there, that could have very easily been a championship team, and he's still playing at that level. So I'm not surprised that they got involved here. I guess I'm just surprised that they went into the degree where this was going to get out. The notion that they made an outright offer, and we've been kicking around for 2 days now what that really means, as you just said. But it feels like if they put Brown on the table and said to Sean Marks in Brooklyn, we're willing to trade Brown here, they're really serious about this. Now, does that mean that they're going to add piece after piece after piece and be super aggressive in getting this done? Not necessarily, but it does say that for the right price, they'd be interested in at least flipping Brown for Durant, which makes some sense. It's not a popular opinion, as I just said here in Boston, but Durant today and maybe for the foreseeable future is the better player of these two. Now, the fit we can kick around.
Yeah, I think people are, it feels weird to say, but people are almost overlooking, I get it. He's 34, he's played, 90 games in the last 3 years. One of those years is obviously because of the Achilles recovery and everything associated with that. So I get it. I understand it. But at the same time, this dude was averaging 29, 30 points last year. I think a really bad playoff series has kind of shifted the narrative almost a little bit too far in the direction of, maybe Durant isn't that guy, he's lost a step. I think some of those things are true, but you put him on a roster where he's surrounded by the pieces that Boston has compared to a Nets team that was basically just in free fall because of how ridiculous last season was really in Brooklyn. And a team that had effectively quit even before the playoffs had started. Because realistically, that is how I feel about the Nets last year. There's just too much happened, I think, for them to really put together a good run. So, I think that with all that in mind, with the context in mind, you're looking at getting a top 6'5" guy in return for somebody like Jaylen Brown, who's top 20, top 25. In that way, I'm always in favor of the team getting the best guy possible. Like that's for me who wins the trade usually is, the team that gets that guy, gets the guy that's going to put you over the top.
So what would it take, you think? The report said Smart, mandatory inclusion there, maybe another rotation player. That's a wide range on the Celtics. Does that mean Peyton Pritchard? Does that mean Robert Williams? There's a pretty big gap between those two players. And of course, I don't think you can get a deal done if you're Brooklyn without all of the picks possible coming back from the other side just because of the remnants of the James Harden trade. You got to restock the picks there. So in my mind, I guess from a Celtics perspective, the most you would give up is probably Brown, Smart, and that package of picks. If you want to flip a rotation player with Brooklyn and make this a little bit of a bigger deal, that makes more sense. Maybe you send a younger guy over to Brooklyn that gives a little bit more upside than one of their older rotation players. That's something we could talk about here. But ideally, from a Nets perspective, what does the final trade package look like if these two sides were able to get something done?
Got to remember that the Nets want to remain competitive. They want to retool rather than rebuild just because they don't have their picks. Now, the thing that is the advantage for Boston is that I think most of us realize by now this rumor is coming out not because these conversations are active, but because the Nets are attempting to generate more of a trade market for Durant. Because really, I mean, the biggest suitors were Miami, which is like a hero Duncan Robinson package.
Oh my God.
Which we don't even need to get started on. Two guys that basically got played out of the rotation. Phoenix obviously now can't really do anything until January. Toronto hasn't been willing to put in Scotty Barnes. So it really becomes like, all right, the Nets are trying to generate a market, but if the market isn't there and things get contentious by the time training camp rolls around, Durant, either sits out or he's just uninvolved completely. Then that's kind of an advantage for the Celtics. And even though the Nets may be asking for, somebody like Marcus Smart next to Jaylen Brown, if there's no other offers or anything like that Brooklyn can go for, then I actually kind of think that the Celtics, weirdly enough, even though they're the team getting the best player involved, they're a little bit in the driver's seat just because they can say, okay, well, what else is out there? Like, what other offers are you guys getting?
Yeah, what's the power of Brown individually in this? If there's nothing else out there, you could feasibly say Brown alone, and this is probably why the offer looks like it does here. Maybe you tack on another pick or two, and that ends up being how the Nets sweeten this for themselves. But Brown and White, as far as players go, that's the most that the Celtics want to take away from their team right now, and that's the most that the Nets can feasibly get from any team, just because of this Ben Simmons situation. We can talk about that in a minute, just how that could be the Nets' next step in terms of making themselves more flexible here. But what is that power of Brown here? Like, would the Nets just eventually say, all right, we'll take Brown because that's such a good starting point for our franchise here?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is that they want an all-star caliber player. So that's the only guy we've really heard in return for somebody like Durant. There hasn't been a situation where somebody like Brandon Ingram's been involved. Ayton's probably one of the best, I guess, I mean, he's not all-star level, but he's one of the better players that has been involved, at least in some, trade rumors. Maybe Siakam is another guy that could have been.
Can't be too exciting for Brooklyn, though.
Yeah, I mean, like it's kind of Brown is like somebody you can really build around in a way. You could put him next to Ben Simmons, and that's a solid, if not spectacular. It's a team. They're not going to win it all, but it's going to be a team that you can at least sell yourself on. Simmons as the third guy, Jaylen Brown as the second guy. Then it just becomes a question of like getting your main guy. But if you're the Nets and you're trying to remain competitive in the interim and stay in the playoff hunt while you're waiting for that next whatever Kevin Durant like player, if you can find that guy, that's an attractive option.
Yeah, it definitely is. And that's, I guess, my first big con here, if we're going to kick around some pros and cons of this for Boston, is that if you send Jaylen Brown to Brooklyn and it becomes his show and he's able to grow over the next year or two here, maybe sign another contract there, I think that's probably appealing to the Nets, to the fact that in a big market like New York, you probably have a pretty good shot at keeping him beyond that contract, depending on how the roster ends up looking in a few years, like all of that. But it's not like you're Orlando or you're Sacramento or something like that. Like, you're in New York City, you're probably going to have a pretty good shot at keeping this guy if this is going to become his team now. Going over there. I know it's a short contract right now that he's on, but the big con for Boston, regardless of how it goes for Durant in Boston, I think Brown would end up being a monster in Brooklyn with the
Mm-hmm.
ball in his hands, able to run pick and roll. And, this might be how it's good for both sides and everybody involved. Brown gets his own team if that's something that he desires. He gets to expand his game and become a superstar down there. Because, again, you just look at the way he bounces around screens with the ball in his hands. And some of the passing stats that Zach Lowe kicked around earlier were pretty impressive, more than I knew he was capable of. And then, the turnovers you got to cut down, but that might be something he gets better at with more reps. And the Nets would certainly at that point have a little more leeway to develop him and some other young guys, as well as Simmons, who could probably take the load off him there a little bit. That's a good duo. You'd love to have Smart there too, but if you're getting Brown, maybe you just don't drive that hard of a bargain if you're Brooklyn. So at the end of the day, Nets end up with their star. Celtics take a big gamble, but one that could push them over the finish line for a championship. I know our commenters hate it and all that, but there's a lot to love here, really, all around. Brown, Nets, Celtics, and maybe there's a deal to be had that, isn't like Cat, Edwards, 7 picks level here, because that always seemed like what the Durant trade would look like, right? But it's just not going to get there. It doesn't seem like the market isn't strong enough.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, I don't know what the Nets, and I do think the Nets are playing a little bit of a dangerous game. And I raised an eyebrow, I guess, a little bit at this rumor coming out when it did. After really this was something that was kicked around early July. I'm wondering if that was something that, now they're like, we didn't get the market we thought we were going to get. Let's try to put this out there to either reinvigorate Boston or just try to generate.
So yeah, it
some
seems
buzz.
pretty clear that's why they did it. Does that hurt the chance that this actually happens? Because I mean, this doesn't look good for the Celtics the last couple of days here with the SMH tweet and everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could go two ways. It could force their hand, or it could really push them out and just be like, you know what, I don't want to. We don't want to deal with this. This is supposed to be a good faith negotiation, and instead you've completely torn up our locker room for reasons that we don't really think is fair. So I could see it going either way, and I guess we'll kind of find out over the next couple of weeks.
So where else could Brooklyn go? Let's say this is over now. It was weeks ago. They throw this out there for some leverage with other teams, and this is in the past. You mentioned Toronto. I think that's an intriguing destination, but you don't love, even if Van Fleet ends up in it, I guess. And I haven't thrown around the salaries on this deal in particular, but if it's like Trent, Van Fleet, and Siakam, and maybe some money going back and forth there. Do you need Barnes? Is that the next guy? And how resistant do you think Toronto is to giving up a guy like that? It doesn't seem like they have any interest in that at all.
Yeah, because it's like, do you feel like if you're Toronto, you give up OG Anunoby, maybe Scotty Barnes? Do you feel like a Siakam, Fred VanVleet, KD team with pretty, I mean, not great depth. I mean, it's, do you feel like that team is going to be the one that's going to put you over the top? I don't know. And I think it seems like they're kind of they're doing the classic, we're building for two eras. We're going to be competitive in the interim, but we also have this guy at Scotty Barnes. We're going to see what that looks like for the next generation of Raptors basketball. So yeah, it doesn't feel like that's a situation where that makes sense. Whereas, when they traded for Kawhi, they were that close. They were that team that was in the conference finals, couldn't get over the top against LeBron. All right, we're going to add Kawhi for DeMar DeRozan and Pirtle. And essentially that's going to be the trade for us that is going to put us in that title conversation. So I think Boston's kind of in the same situation here where they're kind of like that Toronto right now.
Yeah, and they may be able to make up for it with picks. I think the Celtics are at 5 picks right now that they could possibly give up just because they've given up this year's and the 28 swap. I think the Raptors effectively have all of theirs for the foreseeable future. Suns too, although they might be missing a Paul one. So I guess the next guy would be Mikal Bridges, and you could wait till January to get Ayton involved in that or something, and it would depend how the Suns do here. But it looks like there's a real chance, we don't even have to discuss the Miami package, that this goes to training camp. And that's I think the question everybody has right now is what happens when this goes to training camp? Is Durant done with this situation? I don't think he's made enough noise for anyone to believe that, but if the Nets are trying to generate some interest right here it at least seems like they're heavily entertaining the fact that they do have to trade him here, and there's not a lot of hope to bring him back. But we just haven't heard enough from Durant, and that's the tough part in assessing this. What does he want? Why is he leaving? Is there any chance that he waits? Those three big questions.
Yeah, I would say he's probably. I mean, who knows? We really don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know. Durant's never asked for a trade, so we don't know what type of a guy he's going to be. Is he going to be? Is this going to be a James Harden situation where he's partying? Probably not. That's not KD. I do think KD will report to camp. I'm assuming he'll play for. If this goes into the season, he'll play for the Nets. But I think it'll be the vibe that will be off. That's. Durant is, he's somebody that has, I think, sulked in certain situations. There was a lot of reporting when he was in Golden State that kind of indicated that. So I could see that being more of the situation where it's like, yeah, he's playing, but it's like he seems removed from the team almost, and he's just showing up. He's playing, but it's not like he's a part of the Nets in a way. So in that sense, I also could see that derailing a team, maybe not in the way where he's like actually missing time, but it's derailing the team in terms of this. They're just not. There's no identity to this group.
Yeah, and the motive's a big one too. Could you save it by extending Irving? Was this a move that was made in defense of Irving? Is he done with Irving? Like, those are the two routes that he could potentially be taking here that have very different outcomes. And I guess from my view, the situation seems to be that ownership has kind of put its foot down on Irving and his future there. And Durant doesn't like the look of a future beyond Irving there, possibly just because there's no upside to trading Irving right now beyond bringing back Russ and some picks or rerouting some other contracts back because the value just isn't there for Irving. Never mind Durant around the league.
Yeah, Kyrie, I mean, you'd be trading him at absolute lowest value. I mean, maybe you can get him there and he'll look good for till February. And the idea is you'd be able to move him then. I think ownership is pretty done with, both really. I mean, I think they want to bring back Durant, but they recognize like if there's no way to bring back Durant without having Kyrie involved, I think they'd honestly be more open to just ending this thing and trying to start fresh. So that's another thing to think about when you're looking at it from the Nets side. Even though they may posture, hey, we're fine, we kind of want to run this back. I'm a little skeptical of that in a way, and always really have been.
Well, I know it's tough to tell now, but if you had a guess, what do you think the outcome is to all this? Like, we went through this with the Harden situation mid-season, and it was like, wow, this is so far-fetched. You can't even really imagine how this comes out. And it did end up being a pretty far-fetched outcome with Simmons and Harden swapping sides. But you could have imagined that at the time. It was like, all right, Simmons is on this deal, Harden's on this deal. Both sides need to get out from these guys and maybe just flip them. I think the original idea was Kyrie for Simmons, but then it ended up being Harden after he took his seat. But I can't even imagine what this is going to look like when all the dust settles. It's just so hard to imagine where all these different pieces fall. Have you kind of imagined what this is going to look like when it ends?
Yeah, I mean, I think this Boston thing, to me, it makes the most sense for both sides. And I wonder if it's going to be like these two teams are going to meet in the middle. It'll be, Jaylen Brown, Derek White, maybe like a Grant Williams, somebody like that. Maybe that's too much. And like 2 picks or something like that. Like I feel like right now we're looking at this. That would probably make the most sense if they really do. If this is really something that just doesn't come together and maybe Boston pulls out. I could see something like the Nets waiting until January because the Suns are going to probably be the most desperate team going forward. That's another option. So those are the two I'm watching right now. But it's hard to say. Maybe somebody gets off to a really hot start that we don't expect, like a Memphis or something like that, and they're thinking, hey, like, what if this is our year? What if we need a Kevin Durant? I mean, it's kind of hard to tell right now, but I think it's safe to say that the market is not bearing anybody outside of hypothetically Boston. They would want to do something like this drastic with a player 34 years old.
And maybe that's the opportunity that the Celtics saw. Maybe they just thought we could get in at such a low price here, and it's not like Brown's a low price, but the upgrade is Brown to Durant, and then you're not too much beyond that. You mentioned White. That didn't go too well in Boston, so you're basically just moving off that money as salary matching, and you've already replaced White effectively, so that'd be huge to keep the Brogdon Smart duo intact. Still have Pritchard, and then Grant I see in a Bleacher Report reportedly looking for at least 440 extension, maybe as much as 480 and a Keldon Johnson type deal. That's not going to happen in Boston. So it would make sense to deal as well potentially. And again, I'd extend picks. I'm not worried about 5 first-round picks if Durant's coming back, but I do want to get back into the pros and cons first. Athletic Greens, we've been telling you about them on the Garden Report. Huge time for us right now on the Garden Report, and of course here at Dome Theory. They're giving you 5 free travel packs, which you just rip open, pour in your water. It's nutrients, it's probiotics, it's a little bit of everything that you need for your nutrition, and they're giving you a free year's supply of vitamin D as well. It tastes great. It's good powder. It's just kind of like a protein shake. You make it in your protein shake. There's a million different ways you can go with this. But if you go over there, purchase something. People love this. Don't take my word for it. Read the reviews. It's a very, very popular product. And again, we're on kind of like a testing basis with them right now in the Garden Report for the show. If you go over there, get something, you get all of this. I'm John Zanis at John_Zanis. He's going to give you a t-shirt. So all of that's coming your way. You get a great product here with Athletic Greens. Go over to athletic.com/garden. Again, your nutrition, gut health, whole body vitality. That's all you're getting. 9 products in a blend. It's one powder. You're getting all these different things in different places, different meals, different whatever throughout the day to try to get all these nutrition, vitamins, everything you need for just one powder, one scoop every morning. They even have a 60-day money-back guarantee I see here. So there's really no downside, a lot of bonus to trying this, and you're helping us here at CLNS Media. So go over to athleticgreens.com/garden. 1 year supply of vitamin D, 5 free travel packs, and a t-shirt. So can't beat that, Matt. We're going to move on. Pros to this deal for Boston. This is what I got. I love Durant. And again, this isn't very popular, but I'm going to try to pitch Celtics fans on it here because there's a guy, as you said, 52% from the field, staggering mid-range efficiency. My first pro is that this guy is going to solve so much of the offensive stagnancy we saw from the Celtics, not only in the finals, but in the playoffs as a whole. They'd go minutes and minutes and minutes without being able to get a bucket. Turnovers, an immense problem. It was Brown, but it was more so Smart and Tatum in that position during the playoffs. Durant would have the ball in his hands a lot more, be doing more with it, and of course, it would probably change the style of the offense somewhat, but if you have a guy that can put the ball in the net at the efficiency he can, I think that would just knock off a lot of stagnancy in the offense. But some of the struggles we saw Jason Tatum go through, and Jason Tatum, I know he's effective with the ball in his hands, but I think he's a guy who could pretty effectively move into more of an off-ball role. We've seen him kill it in catch-and-shoot spots in the past. That was effectively his role the first couple of years in the league. He's a good cutter, started screening and rolling more last year. You might be able to see these two guys play at each other at a high level. So I know Brown's a great scorer and own upside of being able to play on Tatum's level, but you think of just the pressure that Tatum's received from defenses. Durant would be taking that on, has obviously dealt with that for years, and would probably take Tatum's game to a next level, along with the offense here in Boston as a whole. That is the biggest pro that really has me move like this.
Yeah, I mean, big thing I like is you got two guys that both can create on and off the ball. Durant is, I just think he's a better playmaker than Jaylen. I know he didn't have a great series against Boston, but I thought he had a really good year in terms of the regular season, in terms of, moving the ball, keeping everybody involved. I do think he's a better off-ball defender. He's going to give you more of that, second side shot blocking, although that has declined a little bit since his injury. He still has nights where he's really, really effective in that regard. And yeah, I mean, you've mentioned it, the scoring is what it is. He's one of the 3 best scorers in the league right now. You're putting that guy as your lead option, or your 1A, if you want to call it that. And Tatum is all of a sudden your 1B. I love Tatum as a 1B. Are you kidding me? That's I don't, that for me, it's sometimes basketball is that simple. You think about it like that. You think Jason Tatum, top 10 player, all of a sudden he's the guy next to another guy at that level. I don't know. It excites me. I'd be fascinated to watch them, and just the way they would, work on and off the ball. You'd have each of these guys running pick and roll. Tatum obviously took a jump as a playmaker. You can have him run offense on one side of the floor, Durant fly off a pin down. Opposite side of things, you could have Durant run pick and roll, Tatum come off a flare screen, Tatum come off an exit screen in the corner. These are all things that I think would work really well, and especially with some of the things that Tatum showed in terms of in the playoffs, his ability to get off the ball and relocate, make plays from there. For me, as somebody who loves this stuff, loves the kind of nitty gritty details of it, I think it's fascinating. I mean, really, like to have a wing duo like that is just super intriguing.
I want you to dig a little deeper on the defense too, because that's another layer that I like here. I know, and I've been keen on this as much as anyone, that Durant isn't that force on the defensive. I think where he's taken as big of a hit as anywhere since the Achilles injury is defending guys one-on-one, sort of making those backside rotations inside, playing center as a whole, do a lot of that for Brooklyn. They've had to play Drummond and Claxton and all these different guys, whereas in Golden State, he was legitimately playing a strong defensively. I'm sure you could still get some minutes there out of him if you really needed to in the secondary role if Horford or Rob were sitting down. But I like the fact that at near 7 feet with all that length, some level of switchability still, I think he'd be enough of a fit where Jaylen Brown was in this defensive system to keep this really strong defensive identity that the Celtics have right now. If you're talking about Smart, Tatum, Durant, Horford, and Rob, it's a massive line. You're probably playing 2 4s there, maybe even like 3 centers, whatever you want to call it. But I think you retain enough switchability there that this would still be, maybe not the number 1 defense in the league, but, top 5 here, and enough balance on both ends of the floor to make you the championship favorite.
Yeah, I like the point about balance a lot. I also like that, you've brought up that the fact that he's 7 feet, he does give you a little bit of Horford insurance. I'm not saying like they're at all similar players, but at least like he's going to give you another guy that's...
He'd be in that front court mix, yeah.
Yeah, which I like because Horford's going to be 36, coming off really heavy playoff minutes, deep run. See what it looks like next year. He looked a little, worn. So I guess the treads were a little bit worn by the time the finals rolled around. Bad matchup also, but I like that in a sense. But the floor balance for me is what's really interesting. They probably play a little bit slower. I think losing Jaylen in that regard is going to hurt them a little bit. But that's okay. You're going to be a little bit more meticulous in the half court. And if we know anything about playoff basketball, that's a big thing. You want to have that half court offense. And Durant's a guy that can be a practitioner in that regard.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to go small as effectively for sure there, especially if you give up Smart. And I guess that really is like understand why they're drawing there, because your versatility, your lineup flexibility would really go out the window in a big way if you gave up Smart in a deal like that. You can do a little bit more of 2 guard sets if he's there with Brogdon, and it depends if White's there too. I guess you could basically put White into Smart's spot and get some percentage of his impact if you really had to there. But I understand why they're holding out for Smart, just in terms of being small, have their quarterback on defense. Like, there's a lot of different things Smart brings to the table in terms of keeping the team's identity intact that it's going to be important there. But at the end of the day, if you're like, all right, if you put Smart in, it's going to happen. If you don't put Smart in, it's not going to happen. It's a tough spot to be in when you're talking about the possibility of acquiring Durant here. But like we've said, I think the Celtics are in a pretty strong position to call Brooklyn's bluff and say there's not really much out there. So maybe they do have the power to retain Smart here. And then you're talking about a really good team if you're just swapping out Brown effectively for Durant.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. And I do. And as I said earlier, I think the Celtics are a little more in the driver's seat than Brooklyn would like to admit. And I do think you could heckle over somebody like Marcus Smart. Like, in theory, it's like, oh my God, that's ridiculous. Like, why? I mean, not ridiculous. Let me take that back. But like, Marcus Smart is a great, wonderful player. Him being the difference in a trade for somebody like Kevin Durant in a market that's really competitive, maybe not. But this is not that situation. Durant is such an interesting trade piece because with how much parity there is in the league right now, you can't really, he's like the perfect market inefficiency in a sense where you can't really trade for him without gutting your team. And then if you gut your team, you're not going to have enough to win with him. You look at Toronto as a great example of that. So I think that in a sense, Boston is sitting in the driver's seat a little bit more than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah. My other two pros here, you mentioned one of them. I think there's a bond between Tatum and Durant. And, if Tatum had to move into that 1B spot, I think that's a position he'd like being in because of the fact that I think he grew up watching Durant, looked up to Durant, these two guys. You saw him playing on Team USA last year. I think that's a pair that would complement each other personality-wise pretty well, because I think a lot of the resistance to this move in my mind, beyond people's love for Brown, which I get, is their distaste for Durant. And it's been interesting to see him through Oklahoma, Golden State, and then into Brooklyn become one of the most beloved guys early in his career and then one of the most vilified guys later. But I've always liked his edge. I've always liked the nastiness. I think back to that Philly game last year and some of the battles Brooklyn and Philly had where he was kind of snarling at Embiid. He went out and just in defense of Ben Simmons, annihilated the Sixers in that return game. And they just seem to have like this FU attitude that I think a lot of Celtics fans got frustrated at times that Boston didn't have. You saw Brown kind of fighting back at some of Draymond Green's antics in the finals. But Tatum, when he talked about leadership throughout the year and sort of his approach to that, he emphasized that he's just going to be who he is, which is more of a laid back, easygoing guy on the floor. There's not a lot of fire. There's not a lot of intensity to that. And whether it comes to criticism that Tatum might face in the future or just on court beef or any of that different stuff, I think Durant has an ability to kind of eat that up and allow Tatum to just focus on the basketball. But I guess the downside to that is going into a market like Boston with the media scrutiny, with the fan criticism at times, and just with all the noise. I mean, we know how receptive Durant is to the noise, checking Twitter and everything else. There'll be a steady stream of that coming in from Boston. So I'm higher on his edge and some of the nastiness there coming in because I think it's a good compliment to Tatum. But there is a worry to me in how he'd like this market. And people have talked about his comments about Boston and the race dynamic there. I thought that was more of an Irving-led comment that Durant went along with as his teammate. Again, we could dig deeper into that if we really wanted to, but I'm more concerned about just the level of noise that comes with being the star in Boston, locally and nationally, that might get to Durant and just not really knowing what Durant wants in terms of a destination, a city, a team, a situation for himself. Because again, 1A, 1B right now with Tatum, the way Tatum's rising, Durant could quickly move into a secondary role there as he gets older.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I do think Durant is motivated to win, and he wants to be in a situation where he feels like there's infrastructure, and that was what Golden State, I think, was attractive to him about. Obviously, other things came into play with Curry and that relationship there, and just in general, I think the relationship with the fan base that you may run into in Boston. But I wouldn't be as worried about that. I'd be more worried about some of the other things like injuries, just general decline. Those are the things I'd be a little bit more worried with. Like Durant, for me, at least just covering him, he just wants to go out and hoop. Like there isn't a ton of BS with Durant. Maybe that is just because he's in Brooklyn. I like to call it like a big market, small market team in terms of fan base isn't huge.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Like he's been in
it's
Oklahoma.
The perfect place. Yeah. It's kind of the perfect place for him because he can keep his business ventures going. But he's also, it's not like there's a ton of scrutiny out here.
No, and I didn't think there was a ton in Golden State either beyond the cupcake stuff and the criticism of his choice. But I don't think it was a tough market to play in. Like Durant, Curry, Green, those guys had his back. And the fans, I guess he sort of had a back and forth thing with the fans there in terms of appreciation. But I didn't feel like the Heat was ever – I mean, they were winning championships. How would the Heat be on them there from the fan base? I think Boston would be the real place if things went sideways where he might get a little heat from Boston's fans. But ideally, if he's healthy, if he's producing – and if things are going well, the Celtics fans are going to love him. Even if they don't love the move initially, it kind of brings me back to the Kyrie move. a little tough at the time. You're giving up Isaiah. You're giving up that core, that identity that they had for a couple of years there. Then when you see the dribbling and the scoring and all the different stuff, I think they started 14-2 that year right out of the gate. People were right on board. 11 jerseys everywhere. Everyone loved them. I think people forget just how much Boston fell in love with Kyrie that first year and even into the second year. So very similar situation I feel like that they're in now. That didn't go well. You said it. It's all about the health, the stability of him. My last pro, I love the fact that you'd be entering him into the Warriors Durant thing. Like if that became a finals there, all of a sudden, all the green trash talk and everything that kind of built between these two sides this year, you add Durant into that. I think some added motivation for him to go out and beat those guys. It's a big bonus and a big point of intrigue going into a rematch potentially between those two teams in the finals. That's what has me more excited about the possibility of this than anything else. Because if these two teams met as they stand right now, Celtics and Warriors, I actually think the Warriors got a little bit better. You know, you lost Peyton, you lost Porter, but you bring in Jermichael Green, who's been really good in the past in that role, and Dante DiVincenzo, who, if he recovers from that injury in a rough year last year, is a really good wing player, maybe even more dynamic than Peyton was. So that roster's loaded again. And Celtics, I know they're championship favorites technically right now in some places, but I think they're a little bit short of where the Warriors are as these two teams stand right now.
Yeah, I mean, I might be actually might be the opposite of you on the
You're
Golden
higher
State
on the Celtics.
Yeah, I think Golden State dropped off a tiny bit, like just a tiny bit. I really think they're going to miss Peyton defensively. Just having a guy that can, I mean, he like changed that series.
He was a big part in the finals. Yep.
Yeah, just completely changed that series. So I think they're going to miss that. DiVincenzo is passable on defense. He shot the three ball pretty well in Sacramento. I'd expect that to continue, but
he was rough in Milwaukee, though. Yeah, there's a chance that he just kind of fell off a cliff and doesn't come back, which would be weird to me because I don't feel when he tears ACL, that doesn't usually kill guys' careers anymore, but I guess it is a significant injury for some.
Yeah, I don't. At first, it was a meniscus. I don't know. It was something like
some in his knee.
Yeah, some in his knee. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's I like them. I do think they've lost like a little bit of. I don't like them losing anything on defense because it puts that much pressure on Clay to look a little bit better defensively. Of course, he'll be 2 years removed from the Achilles tear. Maybe I think at least 2 full years. You're looking at Draymond is going to have increased responsibilities. So I like what they did, but I mean, you look at Boston, and I actually saw somebody bring this up earlier, talking about, this is a 2-year window with Durant versus a 5 to 7 year window with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Personally, this is just me. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I can never go that far with any NBA team saying that, hey, this core is going to be together for 7 years. There's just so much player movement now that, in a sense, at least for me, with how I would build a team, if I think there's a way to win in the next 2 years, I'm going to go for that because there's no guarantee that
the value of one's huge now. Yep. I don't think there's, unless you're putting together a Warriors-like team that has that run where they're just such dominant favorites for 2 or 3 years that they're going to be just knocking off win after win after win year in and year out. The value of one's massive just because the rosters are changing so often. There's a new power coming into place every year. There's going to be a cap spike in a couple of years here too, potentially as well. So who knows what happens with that in terms of free agency and some of the new powers that could emerge out of that. All these windows are short. So if you're looking at this from the Celtics perspective, it's like 1 or 2 years with Brown potentially here, or 1 or 2 years with Durant. It's effectively equal. Forget the contract length, the age, all of that. The only downside, and you've mentioned, and it's really my biggest con here, is Durant's health. Now, he sprains the MCL last year. That probably hurt him a little bit, but so did carrying the weight of Harden's inconsistency and Kyrie's absence. I think those were all factors in his decline into the first round of the playoffs. But given his age, given his injury history here, you're probably looking at him as like a 60-game per year max guy. And you do have the depth if you're Boston to work around that. Tatum's such a stalwart in terms of games played, minutes, and all of that, that he would probably pick up quite a bit of slack there and allow Durant to ease into things. But for a Celtics team that's young, dynamic, and overall pretty healthy right now. I thought they were one of the healthiest teams in the league last year among contenders. You'd be introducing a bit of load management, a bit of injury uncertainty, and age, and a little bit less dynamic play with Durant than you currently have on this roster that's just flying up and down the floor, playing the best defense in the league, and overall pretty available throughout the course of the year. So that's my first big con here, and you've hit on it a couple of times, is what's Durant's health look like at this stage of his career?
Well, the beauty of the Celtics is that they have the depth and the identity to survive, putting Durant on load management, whereas you just couldn't do that last year if you were the Nets. I mean, Nash was playing this guy like 40 minutes against the Detroit Pistons and teams like that. Like you have the ability to do that, whether you're resting him for games or just playing him less minutes per game. I'm also going to push back on the health thing a little bit because if you look at 2 years ago during the COVID season, he misses time. I like that. You had that weird thing where he got pulled from the game against Toronto because of health and safety. Then he missed a full week. He basically wasn't practicing with the team, was put in a game, I want to say against the Knicks. Maybe I might be wrong about this. Hamstring strain, pretty much. I would say largely because they didn't ramp him up or anything like that. Last year, even looking at the MCL sprain, that was a freak injury where he just ran into Bruce Brown. I mean, I'm not saying he's not injury prone because that's obviously not a good argument. And there's the evidence points to the contrary, but it's not like this guy is like breaking down in terms of non-contact, injuries. It's more of a year ago, just how weird that season was. And he was the only guy left standing for the Nets in the playoffs against the Bucks in the second round. And then last year, just a freak injury. So you can make that argument, I think, in a way.
Yeah, and that's pretty much where the cons end for me, I guess. The only other concern I guess you would have is potentially giving up too many picks here. Because again, I think we both agree that this deal probably doesn't get done without the maximum amount of picks. Maybe it gets down to 4 or 3, and they meet somewhere in the middle there. But you would be giving up multiple picks that might impact your ability to round out the depth on the roster in coming seasons. But I think we've seen from Brad Stevens trading 3 straight firsts that he's not as intent on team building through first-round picks. So that might not be as big of a problem for him there. I alluded to it a little bit with the potential that Brown could go off and become a star, and that might hurt you a little bit if you're looking down in Brooklyn and seeing that, especially in your backyard there. But how good could the Nets potentially become with Brown, Simmons, I guess what are you talking? Royce O'Neal, TJ Warren, some of these other guys that they're working in there. A good young core. We could probably end the show kicking around some of the young pieces that the Nets have. I guess there's a chance, a worry that the Nets can legitimately in time do this, if you do this deal, become mini threat to you in the East. Like, I think if Brown reaches that next level, leading that team, and Simmons gets back to who he is, you might have a team with the right coach too, of course, that can legitimately threaten the Celtics in the East. And I think that's almost an underrated part of this. Like, people have been asking, would the Nets send Durant to Boston? Well, if Brown and enough's coming back, you might say, all right, we're going to go beat Boston with the team we have.
He could. I don't know if he will. I don't know. I'm a little bit lower on this Nets team. I think they're like a really solid, fun team that'll hang around for a couple of years. I don't see them as like threats to win the East or anything like that. I do think there's a cap on this team. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun core. It makes sense for somebody like Simmons. You're putting a lot of, shooting around him and wing depth around him. And it's a nice team with balance. I just worry a little bit about some of the half court stuff, what that's going to look like. There is a lot on Jaylen Brown's shoulders now. How
good could you potentially see him becoming in Brooklyn? Like, is there a higher ceiling that we're not imagining for him? I almost wonder if this is like it's not quite comparable because, man, I don't think anyone ever imagined the offensive volcano that James Harden would become. But there is a little bit of a Harden feel coming out of Oklahoma City to Houston in a deal like that, right?
Yeah, I'm probably a little lower on Jaylen as the lead guy. I just personally, I know the playmaking numbers are better than we expect. It still just doesn't feel like he's really like floor mapping in a way that you'd probably need him to if he's leading the show for Brooklyn. Because really, outside of that, it's like
you might need a point guard next to him. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like Patty Mills. Yeah. So it's and even Simmons is like yeah, he'll make plays in transition, but you're really going to be using him more as like a hub in the post, and which is kind of gives you varying results. Maybe even more as a screener. I don't know. Running pick and roll with him is a tricky thing just because you can sag so low against him. So, yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm a little bit worried about that for Jaylen, where yes, he's improved a lot, and he's proved a lot in the playoffs last year to a lot of people, myself included, but it's very different from going into a role where you are not just leading the show, but you are the show for the Nets. Whereas, and you don't have somebody like Jason Tatum next to you attracting all that attention.
So, I guess we got to consider too, and this is the other hard thing to figure out here. So you got Kyrie that effectively, as we said, maybe ownership's done with him, but is signed for that 1 year. And they're both on that Kanye Donda representation right now. You saw them chopping it up. Is there a chance that they could kind of have this 1 year run here, and maybe Kyrie reproves himself as a part of this core into the future there? Or if they trade Durant, is Kyrie right out the door after Durant goes?
I would be shocked if he isn't traded right after. Personally, I just like, I think the appeal right now of Kyrie to the Nets is only if Durant stays, because in like I guess an ideal world, you're able to keep Durant if you're the Nets, because really, if you're trying to remain competitive, he's the best player possible that you could get. But if he's gone, like I just think too much has happened. Even if Kyrie may want to stay, I just think the Nets are going to want to start fresh and start over. And a big reason why things got contentious and have been, really the reason things have been the way they've been, has been some of the stuff that Kyrie has done, especially just this last season. The way his decision to not play hung over the team. So yeah, I would be pretty shocked if he's around personally.
Oh man, I almost felt crazy myself when I was pushing that during the year, just how insane it felt that he was taking that hiatus. But it did seem like everybody's come to that agreement that, wow, that was pretty crazy what he did. He basically just didn't show up to the team, and when he arrived, it didn't go much better after that. It's just wacky how these 3 years here went in Brooklyn, and it looks like it's coming to an end here, which is kind of incredible to think about. I do kind of want, before we log out of here, your thoughts on the young guys, because it's not the most exciting topic in the world, but that young core, Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, got David Duke out there at Summer League. It's a pretty entertaining team. And Cam Thomas, again, for the second straight year, one of the better players out there at Summer League. Felt like he got a little underutilized last year. I thought the young underbelly of this team, beyond all the drama and Kyrie stuff going on at the top, the lack of usage of those guys, especially during that stretch where they lost, 17 to 20, they didn't make good use of what I feel like is a pretty talented core of young players on this Brooklyn team. And so that could be part of the next wave too, potentially here, depending on what they get back for both of these stars here. I think Thomas is really good. I like Sharpe. Maybe he looked a little better when he was playing off Harden, and that's sort of what I'm still leaning on with him. But they have some guys here. Nick Claxton's back. I'm stunned they didn't keep Bruce Brown and they kept Patty Mills kind of instead of him. Maybe that's not as much of a trade-off as I'm looking at it as, but they had and have some good young guys here that could maybe carry them forward a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you're the nice part is you have these guys, and you had a really good draft, and even just getting an undrafted guy like David Duke Jr. A year ago, really your last chance at using the draft, just because of all your picks going to Houston. I think in a sense, because the Nets are looking to retool and they're looking to stay competitive in the interim while also trying to build something in the future. You have those guys. Those are nice pieces. Thomas is obviously a guy that the potential is there. Like, you can see what it looks like in terms of the scoring. It's all a question of what he's able to do as a off-ball player. Is the playmaking going to come along? Is the defense going to improve at all? Is he going to start to learn NBA schemes in a way that's going to help the team? So, I mean, I think that in a sense, they're still probably going to focus more on whatever they get back for Durant, at whichever player that is. Let's say it's a Jaylen Brown, Simmons, and a bunch of solid vets. That's probably still going to be more where they lean as they continue to groom and grow with some of these young guys that you just mentioned.
It's going to be fascinating to watch. This really is a negotiation here. If it's still ongoing, if it's one that could have both sides seem to have some pretty significant leverage. The Celtics saying, let's just run this back. The Nets saying, let's try to do the same here. But maybe the content with Durant and potentially budding discontent with Brown here after the SMH tweet maybe pushes both sides to get this going a little bit here, because I really do think there's a lot of fascinating possibilities for both teams here doing a deal like this. And we've kind of gone to a place here package-wise that I think looks a little more reasonable for both sides too. So he is Matt Brooks. You can find him at Nets Daily. You have a Nets podcast as well. Where can people find that?
You can find that on all streaming platforms. It's the Clear Out Podcast. Twitter handle's obviously right here if you're watching along. So, that's pretty much all you need to know.
All right, great stuff, Matt. We'll keep following along as more Nets headlines keep coming out this summer, and we'll talk to you here on Dope Theory again soon.